Hi, my name is Monica from BravoBella Bras, and thank you for joining me for today's sew along. My very first garment that I ever made when I learned to sew was a pair of panties when I was 5 years old. And that really got me hooked on a lifelong love of sewing lingerie. Panties are a great beginner project because they're fairly simple, only a few seams and some elastic, but the techniques that you learn when you make a pair of panties can be applied to any lingerie sewing. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Today I am making the Bella panties from Evie la Luve, and I purchased this. It's a downloadable pattern PDF off of Etsy. And I'm going to be making style number 1. This has 2 views that are all lace and 2 that are fabric with lace on the edges. I'm going to be making the all lace one that has a more full coverage on the back. So before I get started, I want to make sure I know what size I'm going to make. When you are measuring for the size that you want, in the instructions it has you measure for your bust, waist, and hip. I'm really only going to focus on the hip. The bust is not part of this style of pattern. The waist measurement, interestingly, is higher than where this particular style ends. And so what my waist measurement is a size medium, but my hip measurement is a size small. But because this particular style doesn't go all the way up to the waist, I'm really still just going to make the small, which is what my hip size is. I'm going to show you really quickly how to measure your hips. So it's a little bit tricky to see in this dress, but you want to go with the fullest part of your rear end and have your tape measure go parallel straight around to the ground and come around to the front. And it looks like I measure about a 36, which is what the size small is. And I know I said that my waist is a medium, so when I measure my waist, and you want to make sure you're really on your natural waistline, I measure a 30. And like I said before, if you end up being 2 different sizes between your waist and hip, for this particular pattern, you're probably going to want to go ahead and use your hip size. So now that I've decided my size, my next step is going to be to prepare my pattern. I have my pattern pieces printed off, and when you're working with a PDF pattern, it will come in multiple pieces. Usually there's some sort of guide to make sure that when you print it, it's the correct size, so you can scale things when you print it. So you want to double check to make sure you measure the correct size. And then you're going to want to cut the pieces apart and tape them together first before you start cutting them out. So that's my next step that I'm going to do. I always have 2 pairs of scissors in my sewing room. One is for fabric and the other one is for paper. I never use my fabric scissors for my paper because I don't want to dull my scissors. So I'm going to cut along these edges first, and there's guides on the edges here. So this has a little triangle that says 1A. So I'm going to pick up my other piece here, and there's another triangle on this piece that also says 1A. And I'm going to line those up and tape them together. And then on this other side says 2A, and I will line that piece up with this piece and tape those together. Now that I have it all taped together, and I just use a little bit of Scotch tape to do that, I'm going to go ahead and cut it out. When you're using a multi-size pattern, I typically like to actually trace my pattern off. However, because this is a PDF, I can print it off as many times as I'd like. So I'm going to just cut it out on the dotted line for the size small instead of tracing it off. This pattern has 2 pieces. It has the main piece, which is each side of the panties, and then it has this separate crotch piece. So I want to make sure I cut all the pieces out for my pattern. And if you notice, I'm cutting right on the lines. A lot of times I see instructors tell you to just cut around it and then cut the pattern piece and the fabric at the same time. I don't recommend doing that. I recommend going ahead and cutting your pieces right along the lines first and then cutting your fabric separately. If you try to cut the paper and the fabric at the same time, you can change the size just slightly. And in lingerie sewing, because you're working with such small pieces, that can sometimes make a difference in what you're doing. So we have our pattern ready to go, and the next step is to get our fabrics. So this particular pattern calls for a wide stretch lace. So I have a nice wide stretch lace here with a beautiful decorative edge. It's pretty fun. And this is what I'm going to use for the body of my panties. It also calls for a lining piece, and I prefer to always use 100% cotton white cotton crotch piece for my panties. Just for hygiene reasons, I don't like using any dyed fabrics there. And then an elastic. Now, the pattern calls for fold over elastic, and fold over is great. It's one of my favorite elastics to use. It can be a little bit tricky to start with, so I'm actually not going to use a fold over today. I have a really simple, nice, lightweight lingerie elastic that I'm going to use instead for my waistline. All right, so we are going to go ahead and get this laid out here. Now, when I lay out my stretch lace, I want to lay it right sides together. Typically, when you cut fabric, you cut it double, so one layer on top of the other. There we go. And I am actually lining up my pattern here so that when I look through my lace, let's see if you can see that there, the two layers are, that's off just a little bit, the two layers are lined up so the pattern is the same on both sides. When you do that, that will give you your symmetry between the two sides of your panties. So I have that laid out there. And the next thing you want to always check is the direction of stretch. The stretch line goes, sometimes called dogs or degree of greatest stretch, goes along the length of this panty. And you notice this says place along the decorative edge of the lace. And so that's my bottom edge. I'm going to place that right here along the bottom edge of my lace. I knocked it over. Let's get it lined back up. There we go. Almost. I want to keep these lined up so I can get it nice and symmetrical on both sides. There we go. Okay. Now, I personally prefer to use pins when I am cutting out my fabrics. Some people prefer to use weights and a rotary cutter. Either way is fine. I don't use a rotary cutter because I'm always afraid I'm going to cut my fingers off with them. So I use pins. Now the thing about using pins is that you really just don't want to use too many. If I put a ton of pins in all the way around all the edges, I can bunch up my fabrics and it can skew the size and everything. So now I'm going to get my fabric scissors out here and I'll show you. I only have a few pins on the edges, just really in the corners, just to hold the fabric to the pattern. And when I'm cutting, I want to use long, clean strokes with my scissors. I don't want to do a bunch of little chop, like cut, little tiny cuts. I really want to make long, clean strokes so that I can make sure I'm cutting it out. And if you notice, I'm using I'm right-handed, so I'm using my left hand to hold the fabric as I cut along here. And that is it. Now I have my pattern pinned to my lace that I have all cut out and ready to sew. I usually, anytime I'm doing any kind of sewing at all, leave my pattern pinned to my fabric until I'm ready to use it. That way things don't get messed up, accidentally thrown away. Let me tell you how many times I've done that. I also need to go ahead and cut the crotch piece here. So I'm going to pull out my crotch lining and make sure that I have the correct direction of stretch. So the direction of stretch is going across the bottom of this. So it goes across here. When you pull out your fabric, you can check the direction of stretch. It should give in one direction, but really have a good stretch in the other direction. So it's going this way. So I'll leave this on here and go ahead and cut this out. So now I have my crotch piece cut out, and I already had my crotch piece cut out of my lace as well. So we are ready to get started. Okay, so I only ever use a regular conventional machine. I don't usually use a serger for my lingerie sewing. So I just have a really simple little machine here. This is my go-to machine. In terms of thread, you want to make sure you use a really good high quality 100% polyester thread. I like Metrocene. This one actually is by Superior Threads called So Fine. I absolutely love this thread as well. So you just want to make sure it's a really good high quality 100% polyester. For your needle, it sometimes depends on what machine and what fabrics you're using, but I find for most of my lingerie sewing, I tend to use a size 75/11 universal needle. It works pretty well for pretty much everything that I do. Before I get started though, I definitely want to do a little bit of test sewing. So I'm going to do that now and make sure that my machine is sewing properly, and that also that it's going to play with the fabrics well. In terms of stitches, I'm actually going to use a straight stitch for all of my seams, and then I'll use a zigzag for my elastics. So I have it set on a straight stitch. When you're sewing, you're going to need a 1/4 inch seam, and so I have mine set exactly so that I know exactly where my 1/4 inch seam is with where I want to line my fabric up. And then I use about a 3 length, and that's a little bit longer than most people recommend. Most people will recommend about a 2.5 length. When I'm working with knits, I tend to err on having a longer stitch length. That's because knits, if your stitch length is too short, it can start to bunch up and pull the fabric and can also cause waves and ripples. So if you're having trouble with waves and ripples, try lengthening out the stitch length a little bit. That sometimes helps. So I'm just going to test here. Oops, it was winding the Robin. There we go. And it's working just fine, looks like. It's good. So I have just a little scrap of fabric that I've just sewn, and I've sewn to the end of it, but I'm actually not going to take that out. And that's because I'm going to use that to sew off on as I make my panties. So I pulled out the instructions here, and step 1 starts with styles 3 and 4, which we're actually making style 1. So I'm going to skip over here to step 4. And so the first instruction that it gives me says to actually sew the crotch piece together. So that's where I'm going to start. And I'm going to grab my, now that I'm ready to use it, I can take my pattern piece off, set it to the side, and it wants me to lay these 2 right sides together. So I'm going to look at my jersey. It really doesn't matter which side is the right side on jersey knit, but I tend to like making the ones with the lines instead of the loops, the right side. So I'm going to put the right side of my jersey knit to the right side of my lace. And I'm going to sew along the 2 edges of my crotch. Now, before I start sewing, I want to pin them together. And a lot of times what you'll see when you're taught to pin is to take your pin and pin it perpendicular to the cut edge like this. That makes it so that you have very little control of your fabric between pins. Now, it's really not that big of a deal in a garment like this because you're not working with huge amounts of curves, everything's laying pretty flat. But once you get into your more complex lingerie sewing where you're making maybe a bralette where you've got lots of curves and such like and stuff like that, you'll definitely want to have more control of your fabric than what you have here. So for all of my sewing, 100% of the time, I don't use perpendicular pins. Instead, I do what's called pin stitching. And that means that I will put my pin in parallel to the cut edge exactly where I want it to sew it. So this pattern calls for 1/4 inch seams. So I'm going to take my pin and I go in, let me see if I can show you here. I go in and out and in and out. So I end up with it looking like I have stitched it with my pin. What that does is it gives me absolute control of my fabric the entire length of the pin, so that as I'm sewing, I can actually slide that pin out as I go and maintain good control the entire time. The other thing about pinning that you want to make sure that you're aware of is you don't want to overlap your pins. If you overlap your pins, you can bunch up the fabric. Basically, it's going to sew exactly like you pinned it, so you want it to lay nice and smooth. So there's my pinning. It looks like the edges aren't even, that cotton edge is curling back. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and start stitching this. I'm going to stitch it with a straight stitch. And this is where, excuse me, a lot of times people struggle a lot with knit sewing, because if you try to start just on the edge of this fabric with nothing behind it, the fabric can get sucked down into the throat plate on your machine and get all bunched up and everything. So instead, if you remember, I tested that piece of fabric and I left that scrap underneath my machine. I sewed all the way to the end of it. I plant my needle, so my needle is down into my fabric. I lift the presser foot, push this up against the other fabric, and I sew straight from one piece of fabric to the next. I'm gonna just use a straight stitch here. You don't need to back stitch. Now you can see that I'm actually sewing right up to the end of my pin, and I'm gonna slide it out as I sew, and that gives me control of my fabric the whole way. Sew to the end and pull it out from underneath. Now you can see here where I've sewn off of my scrap piece of fabric right on to my panties, and that's allowed me to keep really good control of the start point on my panty fabric so that it doesn't get sucked down in. So I'm going to cut this off, and I will do the same thing again, and I just use the same little piece of fabric and kind of keep sewing over and over again, and I'm going to sew down the other side of it. Now that my crotch is done, I'm actually going to stop and press it. It's absolutely critical anytime you're doing any sewing at all to always go back and press your seams twice. The first time you press it flat as it was sewn underneath your machine. Then you turn it and press it however you want it to sit in the garment. So in this case, I'm going to press it just like it is, flat as under my machine here. And then in this case, we're going to turn this right side out. So I'm going to do that very carefully. And now I'm going to press the edges so that it lays nice and smooth here. All right, just like that. Now, the instructions don't call for this next step, but I like to make sure that my crotch piece is not gonna shift around on me. So I'm actually gonna go back here and I'm gonna just top stitch right along the edge, making sure that I catch my seam allowance as I go down each side. And again, I'm gonna sew off on my fabric to make sure that it doesn't get caught in my throat plate. Like I said, totally not necessary, but I just really like the way that finishes the crotch piece off, so I'm gonna press it one more time. Perfect. And now we are ready to move on to the next step. All right, now that we have our crotch piece done, we are ready to start with the main part of our panties. So I've just taken them off of the pattern piece, and the instructions tell us to do the center front seam first, and so that is the shorter end. And when I took it off the pattern piece, I just leave it together, right sides together, just like it was on the pattern when I cut it out, because that's exactly how we're going to sew it. So I'm again pin stitching down my 1/4 inch seam here, so my pins are parallel to the cut edge. And I'm going to use a straight seam to just sew straight down. There it is. And in this case, I don't need to worry about back stitching or locking any of my stitches, because most of the stitches are going to be gone over a second time. So I will let you know where the places are you need to back stitch. There we go. And I'm going to press this flat as sewn. And then I'm actually going to press this open now, so my seam is open. And I have a very fancy sewing tool here, a chunk of wood that I lay over my seam after I press it to let it cool and set, and that really helps the fabric to set nice and smooth how I want it to lay. All right. So there is my center front seam, and now I'm going to attach my crotch. And so I'm going to take my crotch piece and I'm going to fold it in half and put one perpendicular pin in there in the middle, and that is going to help me line up the seam that I just sewed with the middle of the crotch piece. I'm going to lay these two right sides together here. Again, pin stitching, and I'm going to line up that pin that I put in with the center of my crotch and the seam here. There we go. So I have it pinned with my crotch pinned right side to the right side of my crotch to the right side of my panty piece. And I'm going to do a little straight stitch across here. Now this is a place where I'm going to do a little back stitch. I just go backwards a few times and then I'll keep sewing on. That's because this seam is actually not going to get to be gone over a second time. Piece is attached to my panty, and I am going to again press this flat as it was sewn. And then press it open. Okay, now on this particular pair of panties, you end up with this seam allowance being a bit of a raw edge. I'm not a super fan of that, so I'm actually, and the instructions don't say to do this, but I'm actually going to go and I'm going to sew back over all the way across the top of this with a zigzag stitch, and that's going to finish off this edge so I don't have it sticking up at all. And so I'm going to come back over to my machine, and I'm using a 3 width and a 3 length zigzag, and take a couple stitches, and then I am going to back stitch again here. Just make sure all the layers are nice and smooth as you sew across it. Back stitch again. When you stop your machine from sewing, you always want to make sure that your needle's all the way up at the top. And then you can pull your fabric out from behind there. And trim the threads. There we go, and one more quick press. And now that's gonna lay nice and smooth on the inside of my panties. So, the next step that it says to do is to sew the elastic across the top edge. It calls for a fold over elastic, which I absolutely love fold over elastic. It can be a little bit trickier to use, and so I'm actually going to use a simple lingerie elastic because I only have to sew this down one time. Just lay it onto the top and sew it down. So you can see this is just a nice lightweight lingerie elastic. And I'm sewing this to the right side of my panties. Now, when I'm pinning this down, I can pin this so that the top edge cut edge of my lace is all the way at the top edge of my elastic. That's totally fine. You can do it that way, and then after you sew it, you would trim off the excess. However, because I'm going to be sewing this down the bottom edge of my elastic is where your stitching is going to be, I'm actually going to line up my lace down here at the bottom edge as well, overlapping it a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch, and that way I can just sew it down and I don't have to worry about trimming it off. Just saves me one step. Now notice that I put one pin at the end of my elastic. I don't have pins in any of the rest of my elastic. If you try to pin elastics down when you're using them, it can cause them to bunch and do all kinds of weird things. So I usually don't pin my elastics down. I am going to go ahead and sew off of my scrap of fabric. It'll help me get started so nothing gets bunched up underneath here. Just take a few stitches to get started. Now, one of the keys when working with elastics is you want your elastics to be handled with one hand and your fabrics with the other hand. So I'm going to use my left hand to move my fabric underneath, and I'm always going to have my elastic coming off from under the machine straight towards me. If I'm trying to turn my elastic with curves and stuff, it can get stretched out or you can miss it or pull out from underneath it. This particular pattern doesn't have you measure for elastics. It just wants you to pull it just slightly as you're sewing it, not so that the elastic gathers it up at all, but just so it gives a nice contour. And so I am going to just pull just slightly on my elastic separately from my fabric. Notice that I'm not handling my fabric at all. I'm pulling the elastic back just a tiny bit. Then I'm going to put my finger down. So now I'm working with both my elastic and my fabric together, and I'm going to actually let my elastic ease back up. If you stretch your elastic out and you hold it and then try to sew it, your feed dogs will actually pull the elastic more than what you want it to, and it can stretch out of shape. A lot of times when people have issues with sewing elastics down, it's because they're pulling it and then the feed dogs pull it more and then it gets all stretched out of shape, and that's why you get waves and stuff in your elastic. So again, I'm going to pull it just slightly, ever so slightly, put it down on my fabric and let it ease back. And then I use my left hand to just guide and make sure that my fabric stays lined up underneath there. Also notice that I'm only doing little tiny amounts at a time. I'm not trying to work with my whole garment here, just maybe 2 or 3 inches at a time. My mom always says that I sew like I drive way too fast. I won't even tell you how many speeding tickets I may or may not have, but this would be a place where, you know, take it at your own pace. Definitely do a little bit at a time. Just get the feel of the elastic underneath. I cut my excess elastic off. And there is, oops. And there is my elastic on the top of my panties. We are almost done. I'm going to give my elastic a quick press here. Now, our next step is going to be to sew the center back seam. So I'm going to, again, lay my panties right sides together and pin along this center back seam. And I'm going to pin it so that I start at the bottom and come up. And I need to switch back over to my straight stitch. back stitch at the bottom because I'm going to sew my crotch back down over it, but I am going to back stitch up here at the top. Press it flat as sewn, and then press this open. Okay, and now I am going to do my back crotch seam, which again, I'm going to place the right side of my panties to the right side of my crotch. And I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but when I'm pinning this down, I want to pin it so that my most substantial fabric is down towards my feed dogs. In this case, I'm pinning it so that my cotton crotch lining will be down towards my feed dogs, and the fabric of the panties will be up towards my needle. That just helps me be able to manage it a little bit better. So you can see here I have it pinned straight across there. Stitch to the end of that fabric that I'm sewing off on. Now this again, I am going to back stitch here. So stitch a few times and then go backwards a few times just to make sure I lock my stitches. Press that flat. All right, so I pressed it flat as sewn and pressed it up, and now I'm going to do the same thing that I did on the front, which was I'm going to go back and I'm going to sew and finish off that raw edge with a little bit of a zigzag. Trim my threads. My mom was always nagging on me about having threads hanging off. So make sure you trim all your threads nice and neat. And I'm actually going to do one more quick thing after I press that. And that is just a tiny little detail, and that is in my waistband. Notice that now I have this little flap of elastic up here at the top. I don't like that raw edge very much, and so I'm actually going to do a little bit of a zigzag down and up across there just to hold that down. So in this case, I sew straight down it, I plant my needle, so my needle is down in my fabric. I leave my needle in, pick up my presser foot, turn the entire garment around, and I'm going to sew right back up to the top. When I get to the top, I'll lock my stitches. And that just gives me a really nice finish now. And we are done. So there's our fabulous cute little pair of panties off of the Bella panty pattern from Evie la Luve. Found on Etsy. It's a downloadable PDF. In order to find all of your fabulous fabrics that for all of your panties and bra making supplies, you can check out Bra Builders at www.brabuilders.com. And for more tutorials and instructional videos for bralettes, panties, and all kinds of different bras, you can check out my website at www.bravobellabras.com. So I hope you enjoyed making these today. It's super fun, super fast, and be careful because once you get started with lingerie, you may get hooked and never go back. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy your new adventures in lingerie making.